the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Monday, February 23rd, 2015. Walmart's announcement of a wage increase is a surprise, but it's still not enough. We'll speak with journalist Josh Eidelson, who's been following the story for years, and why the White House Summit on Countering Violent Extremism is misguided. My guest Hussam Ayloush of CAIR will explain. Plus, when Americans lynched Mexicans, we'll speak with historian and researcher William Carrigan about a little-known chapter of U.S. history. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Rahul Mahajan. He's a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. Hi, Rahul.
Hi, Sonali.
A 7-year-old girl with bombs strapped to her body was killed in a market in the Yobe state of Nigeria yesterday. 5 others were also killed and 19 others injured in the suicide bombing, prompting fears once more of a rise in attacks by the militant group Boko Haram. Already, Nigeria's elections, slated to take place a few days ago, were postponed to early March because of instability. President Goodluck Jonathan, who's running for re-election, conceded that his government has once more underestimated Boko Haram's strength. The killing at the market was not the first time bombs had been strapped to young children. Since 2009, more than 10,000 people have been killed and 1 million Nigerians left homeless. Nigeria is home to major oil and gas operations owned by multinational corporations like Royal Dutch Shell. Well, Rahul, is Nigeria spiraling out of control?
Well, I think we shouldn't overstate it. I think it's somewhere between, say, on the one hand, Pakistan, which has significant areas of the country that it's not able to keep under control, but where there's still a very powerful central state that exerts a lot of control, and on the other hand, say, Libya or Somalia, where after the states collapse, there's been really no creation of a new state. Nigeria has a big problem in the northeast that's unable to deal with. It's also potentially unable to deal with cross-border incursions of Boko Haram into other countries. So it is certainly faced with a severe crisis.
And U.S. and Iranian negotiators gathered in Geneva last night for a high-level meeting. Secretary of State John Kerry and Energy Secretary Ernest J. Moniz are meeting this morning with Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif and the director of Iran's atomic energy program, Mr. Ali Akbar Salehi. The two-country energy representatives are for the first time part of U.S.-Iran negotiations. At stake is the lifting of economic sanctions on Iran in exchange for curbs on Iran's nuclear program. The U.S. has insisted for years that Iran has tried to secretly develop nuclear weapons, while Iran has maintained that it's only interested in peaceful energy negotiations. Negotiations under Iran's new leadership of Hassan Rouhani began last year and have already been extended twice. Israel has presented the strongest opposition to a warming of U.S.-Iran relations, claiming that Iran is a threat to Israel. Rahul, do you have any hope that this round of meetings might result in success?
I don't think it'll result in full resolution. I think actually Zarif said it best when he said the West, and in particular the United States, clings to the idea that it's the sanctions are necessary for political leverage over Iran to keep them negotiating. And until they abandon that, then of course they are not going to come up with any agreement that involves lifting the sanctions, which will mean that Iran remains unsatisfied. It's also, there's something a little bit hallucinatory about all of these negotiations, which, I mean, I must say that over the last year or two, they've gone fairly well in terms of you know, reaching some kind of modus vivendi. But it's very funny that this is happening while the United States engaged in a massive act of cyber warfare against Iran, and where the United States at least believes, according to NSA documents, that Iran is engaged in cyber warfare attempts against the United States. So I think that background has to be kept in mind when you're thinking about potential success of these negotiations.
And finally, Al Jazeera has announced today that it has obtained a trove of classified intelligence documents from national spy agencies of several countries. Collaborating with the Guardian newspaper, Al Jazeera's investigative unit says it will begin publishing what it is calling the spy cables. The documents are from 2006 to 2014 and include files from South Africa's Secret Service and its dealings with agencies like the US CIA, Britain's MI6, and Israel's Mossad. Justifying their publication, Al Jazeera wrote, quote, "Intelligence agencies are overclassifying information and hiding behind an unnecessary veil of secrecy. This harms the ability of a democratic society to either consent to the activities of their intelligence agencies or provide adequate checks and balances to their powers." Rahul, the cables also contrast with those that Edward Snowden leaked to the press in that they focused on human intelligence rather than electronic intelligence. And of course, last night, the documentary Citizens 4 by Laura Poitras, based on Snowden's story, won the Best Documentary Award at the Academy Awards ceremony. Are media outlets, you think, more confident of publishing secret documents because of what Snowden did?
Well, Sonali, I think there's sort of a pendulum swing here. In the United States, you know, when the New York Times started publishing the Pentagon Papers, the government took it all the way to the Supreme Court before the right to publish these classified documents was actually firmly established. In the decades after that, I think U.S. media outlets felt pretty comfortable publishing these kinds of documents with them until sometime after 9/11, and especially during the first term of the Obama administration, when there was a real ratcheting up of use of the Espionage Act and attempts to get at not only leakers of secrets, but even journalists who wouldn't divulge their sources. So the attempt at sort of chilling that atmosphere and keeping, in particular, U.S. media outlets from publishing these sorts of things, that has, I think, been counteracted in part by a number of things. First of all, the fact that Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, people like this who have gotten documents out, get them out simultaneously to sources, media outlets in other countries, which are going to publish them anyway. So I think they've created a certain sort of penumbra of protection for U.S. media outlets. But in general, yes, I think that publishing these kinds of things is on the upswing again.
Rahul, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you next week. Rahul Mahajan is a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. You can now watch Uprising on Free Speech TV, which airs on Dish Network Channel 9415, DirecTV Channel 348, and on hundreds of part-time cable affiliates and on Roku. Walmart made a surprise announcement on Thursday that it would be raising wages of its $500,000 U.S. workforce to $9 an hour by this April and then $10 by next February. In a press release, the world's largest private employer said, quote, "Walmart has represented a ladder of opportunity since it started, and the company wants to ensure that this remains a vital part of the Walmart experience." The company's reputation has suffered serious blows for years now for paying poverty-level wages to its workers, ensuring that a very large fraction of them have to rely on government assistance to survive. Walmart has also faced scores of lawsuits for gender discrimination, among other things. But in the past 2 years, union organizers have been working with some Walmart employees to agitate for better conditions and wages. The group Our Walmart last November led the first coordinated sit-ins at Walmart stores in the history of the companies, and employees have also launched a number of one-day strikes and walkouts during busy shopping days, such as Black Friday. So does the new move to raise the base pay of Walmart workers mean that the company has salvaged its ugly reputation? Joining me to answer that question is Josh Eidelson. He is a reporter for Bloomberg Businessweek and a former Salon writer who has closely followed the activism by Walmart workers. His latest article is entitled "Walmart May Be Cheap, but It Would Rather Give Up Money Than Power." Welcome to the show, Josh.
Thanks for having me back.
Well, did you see this wage raise coming, or were you blindsided, even if you've been following the story?
I think this is a dramatic move and not one that I think many other observers would have seen coming a week or two ago. Certainly, this is less than what Walmart could do, and it's less than what both Walmart employee activists and folks outside the company have been agitating for. But it's more than a lot of people would have expected a couple years ago, when for the first time we started to see coordinated U.S. retail store strikes at Walmart, something that had never happened in the company's 50-year history. So when you look at a $9 or $10 wage floor, certainly that's less than what many people would consider a living wage, and it's something that many Walmart employees in certain states would have, or municipalities would have had to be paid under upcoming or current law, or are being paid anyway. Still, for a company that currently has some employees making $7.25 and that is famous for not being overly generous in the way that it pays people, or for that matter, suppliers, this is a big deal. And a $9 and then $10 wage floor is a major change in how Walmart is going to be seen and how Walmart does business, though it's an incremental one.
Let's get into some of these numbers. The Daily Beast did an analysis of the wage raise, and it said Walmart's workforce is split about evenly between full and part-timers. Part-timers will make $17,500 a year if they work 35 hours a week for about 50 weeks a year. Full-timers will make $26,000 working 40 hours a week for 50 weeks. So for a two-person household, the federal poverty line is $15,930. For a four-person household, it's about $24,250. So we're talking here in the best case scenario, workers just barely being above the poverty line with Walmart's new wages.
Right. This policy is not an end to Walmart being a working poor employer. It's not an end to Walmart workers being in poverty, but it is a step, and the latest in a series of steps over the years that Walmart has made that at least have the potential effect of dampening or complicating outside or internal criticism that it's got, whether from workers or environmentalists or others who have gotten in the way of Walmart's reputation.
As far as you can tell, will the wage increase change much about workers' reliance on public government assistance?
Well, so it remains to be seen what the breakdown is, and the question of exactly how well Walmart pays is something that has been hotly contested over the past couple of years.
Right, and can you address that for a second too? I mean, why is it so hard to get numbers on how much Walmart just pays its employees very specifically before and then even after this raise might take effect?
So Walmart has put forward a series of numbers which have then been contested by activists. Activists have put forward numbers that have been contested by Walmart. Walmart had a figure it was using for a while, which left out part-time workers and included management. Activists put forward figures, including one from Glassdoor.com. There was a funny moment in which Walmart chose to brag at a Goldman Sachs get-together about the nearly 500,000 at least employees in the U.S. who were making more than $25,000 a year. Activists then took that figure and said, well, doesn't that mean that the majority of Walmart workers in the U.S. are making less than $25,000 a year? And so certainly being able to say we have a $9 or after 6 months training $10 next year wage floor gives Walmart a much snappier, more succinct response to criticism of being a so-called poverty employer, and it will move some people and not others.
But do you attribute this move by the company to the pressure put on it by our Walmart and these organized walkouts? I mean, granted that only a very tiny percentage of Walmart's workforce has even been able to have the courage to or been able to risk their jobs to do the kinds of things they've done. I mean, I can't imagine that Walmart just out of the goodness of its heart in a vacuum decided to do this.
Sure. So certainly you can point to labor market factors. You can point to nudging from the White House, any number of factors. But I think it is difficult to ignore the role of, again, the first coordinated walkouts at U.S. Walmart stores in the company's history in the United States. This is something that has captured tremendous media attention. It's something that's gotten in the way of Walmart's relationship with its customers, with the media, with cities in which it's trying to expand. And it's a kind of tactic that we increasingly see as political and economic and judicial changes have made it more difficult to do strikes that shut down and disrupt production. Increasingly, unions and labor groups, in some cases like our Walmart, a non-union labor group backed by a union, have turned to the set of tactics that use strikes but as an anchor on a broader campaign of political and legal and media and consumer pressure, where the goal of the strike is not primarily to shut down the store. The goal of the strike is to capture public imagination and develop worker leadership and demonstrate workers' willingness to make sacrifice and put themselves on the line and take that risk and use that strike as part of a larger array of weapons to beat up on a company until it reaches some kind of accord.
What about the fact that other companies like the Gap and IKEA in recent months also voluntarily increased their base pay? Does that add to the sort of pressure that Walmart might have been feeling?
I think it does. And I think it speaks to the fact that there is a larger environment of attention to low wages combined with greater ambition and different horizons in terms of what's seen as reasonable when it comes to decent pay. And that can be credited not only to Walmart workers going on strikes, but also in part to the other efforts, high-profile walkouts by workers like fast food employees or subcontracted janitors at Target, that this wave of strikes has helped to shift the conversation in terms of how much we're talking about low pay and the fact that now there's conversation about $15 pay rather than $9 something.
Right. So let's go back to what you touched on earlier, which is that, of course, there are plenty of Walmart workers living in states where their state minimum wage, and maybe even in cases where the local city level minimum wage is significantly higher than $9 or $10 already at $9 an hour, maybe higher than that. And so we're only talking about those who are living in areas where the federal minimum wage holds that this rule would impact. Do you have any sense of what impact this decision will have on Walmart's bottom line?
Well, Walmart certainly can afford this. There was a study by Demos looking at how retailers like Walmart actually spend more, in many cases, on stock buybacks than what it would cost to pay $12 or more an hour to their employees. The point has been made that retailers also can save money. Companies can save money when they pay employees more, if that leads to more productivity and it leads to lower turnover. That's not to say, as some people on the left have claimed, that Walmart's business model currently doesn't work for Walmart. By all signs, Walmart's business model is working decently to very well for Walmart. It is to say that Walmart's business model is not the only business model that's available to Walmart. And you can look at the success of higher wage companies and say, actually, there are different ways to turn a profit. And if Walmart moves towards a different model, even incrementally, that continues to make a profit but involves higher pay for employees, then there are all kinds of positive benefits for the larger economy. That said, many workers would like to see Walmart go much further than so far it's announced it will.
Of course. And I mean, there's also the sense that given the size of Walmart, that this is, the world's largest private employer, that to do this, even just in the United States, could it have a sort of economic stimulus effect, not just for the economy at large, but probably even for itself? I mean, when workers are paid more, chances are many of them are going to spend some of those extra dollars at the store itself.
Well, if Walmart workers take the extra money and spend it at Walmart, then that's more money that Walmart will receive that way, as well as more money that potential other employers will get from Walmart workers who now have a little more money in their pocket. Again, we're talking about workers who in many cases will still be in poverty under this new wage system.
And what about Congress and pressure on Congress? There's been a lot of pressure from Democrats in the White House to raise the federal minimum wage, and Republicans have been just completely intractable on this issue. Even those Republicans whose own constituencies might have voted in last November's elections to raise their states' or cities' minimum wages. Does this move by Walmart shame Congress and those congressional lawmakers who are standing in the way of a federal minimum wage increase?
Well, shame is somewhat subjective, but I don't think it will prompt them to pass a minimum wage increase. When you look at the United States now, this year, we have a majority of states with a higher wage set than the federal minimum wage for the first time since 2007, which was, at the time, the first year in a while where that happened. In 2007, we saw a federal minimum wage increase. The difference is, for that increase to pass, it had to get past Republican President George Bush. That is a much lighter lift than trying to get a wage increase past a Republican House and Republican Senate under the current alignment and context that we have in U.S. politics. I don't think that John Boehner's House or Mitch McConnell's Senate is going to pass a federal minimum wage increase. And what that means is that that pressure, rather than having some kind of release through Congress, is going to continue to bubble up, on the one hand, against private employers, with workers demanding they act to raise pay or to begin to bargain collectively over pay. And on the other hand, in states and municipalities, whether via referendum, via legislation, to make some kind of increase. And that's something that we've seen. We saw in November, as I've written about at Business Week, 4 red states that sent Republican senators to Congress in the same election, on the same election day, decide to raise pay. We've seen cities go much farther than what's being talked about in Congress, going even eventually to $15 an hour, in some cases pairing a minimum wage increase with some kind of other benefit, like regulation around scheduling. And that is the trend that we will continue to see.
So finally, Josh, how has our Walmart, this union-backed non-union group that is helping to organize Walmart workers, how have they responded to the announcement by Walmart to raise wages to $9 and eventually $10 an hour, given that one of their, first of all, it's just one issue that they're fighting for, higher wages, that there's a whole slew of other issues, but then the wages that they're fighting for are about 50% higher than what Walmart is offering. They want $15 an hour, and Walmart has basically put 10 on the table.
Right. So as you'd expect, they've said this would not have happened without workers going on strike and protesting and sitting in, and it's not enough, and that they will continue their efforts, as you would expect that they would. The question is whether, to what extent, this fuels the momentum and leads workers who may have been on the fence or may have been too scared to get involved. Keep in mind that 20-some workers who went on strike with our Walmart subsequently were fired by Walmart. Whether some of those workers who have chosen not to get involved or step back their involvement will now step it up. The other question is whether the public campaign here, this is in significant part a campaign that's about Walmart's image, has a more difficult time continuing to keep public pressure on Walmart if Walmart is seen as not the worst actor in the bunch. And so that's a challenge for the campaign.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Josh, as always, for joining us today. And we'll link to your article from our website at uprisingwithsonali.com. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Josh Eidelson is my guest. He's a reporter for Bloomberg Business Week and a former salon writer who has closely followed the activism by Walmart workers. This is Uprising, and we'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. You can now subscribe for direct access to all our shows online at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Your subscription sustains the TV production of Uprising. 3 British Muslim girls are thought to be traveling to Syria from England to join the Islamic State group. The girls, aged between 15 and 16, reportedly left their families without informing anyone. Security camera footage from Gatwick Airport shows they flew to Istanbul, possibly en route to Syria. UK Prime Minister David Cameron said the news was, quote, deeply concerning, feeding the growing fear that Western Muslims may be fueling ISIS. It is such a fear that formed the basis of a widely criticized conference last week organized by the White House called Countering Extremist Violence. Both President Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry addressed the three-day summit, which many leaders from the Muslim community boycotted, angry that it was further stigmatizing their community, and which many right-wing ideologues denounced as not targeting Muslims more openly. One of the nation's most prominent Muslim civil rights organization, Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR, signed on to a joint letter with several organizations citing their, quote, grave concerns about the summit. My guest is Hussam Ayloush. He is a human rights and civil rights activist and community organizer, executive director of the Los Angeles area office of the Council on American Islamic Relations. He's a third-term elected executive board member to the California Democratic Party and also serves on the board of the Muslim American Homeland Security Congress. Welcome to Uprising, Hussam.
Thank you, Sonali, for having me.
Well, first, can you explain how this 3 days of conferences is actually part of this broader effort by the Justice Department announced last year to curb homegrown terrorism, to use the right-wing phrase?
Well, I mean, the problem is that the whole program is set on false premises or inaccurate premises. It seems to be like a political stunt, mostly done for PR purposes, to allow law enforcement agencies and the government to appear as if they're doing something to address the issue of terrorism and extremism, which is a real threat. No one is debating that. There are terrorists, there are bad people there who are trying to cause harm to other people. The problem is, when it comes to the American Muslim community, those numbers are so small statistically, even the most exaggerated numbers coming from the U.S. government point to no more than about 100 people from the American Muslim community who have joined ISIS in Syria or Iraq.
And this is a community of many millions.
It's 6 to 8 million people who are positively contributing to their country. So basically a program like that stigmatizes the whole community in a way that, imagine if we decide to announce a countering syphilis problem in some church or some Christian church or Jewish community or so, or any other community in such an unfair way. It basically stigmatizes the community and portrays it or depicts it through the prism of extremism and terrorism, and that is unfair.
Who was invited to attend the summit? I understand it wasn't just domestic community groups and leaders. There were also country representatives from places like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, Bahrain and the UAE, which have very poor human rights records of their own.
And this is the hypocrisy of the whole program. I mean, not to say that everyone who attended approves of such behavior. I know several people who actually attended to go and make a clear point that this program is not acceptable. But however, you pointed out very correctly, there were representatives from about 60 countries. Many of them are themselves guilty of fueling this climate of extremism, including our own government, by the way. I don't want to clear our name in it, which is part of why we object to the CVE, or Countering of Violent Extremism program. Because what it is, it tries to whitewash the real causes of that extremism, and that it's usually the repression, the political repression, the illegal occupations, our support for military coups, and representatives of the military coup governments and the repressive governments being at that meeting. It's if we are to address extremism and violent extremism specifically, and which is something we fully support, let's deal with it at the root causes, not in a selective way that only targets American Muslims. Because, by the way, even according to the U.S. government, violent extremism exists in every community. The one coming from the Muslim community is actually a tiny minority in the U.S., and yet the government decided to launch such an initiative only targeting American Muslims and no other community.
Well, Hussam, let's actually hear an excerpt, watch an excerpt of President Obama's speech at the Countering Violent Extremism conference. It was a lengthy speech, and he gave it, I understand, on the first day of the conference last week. One aspect of it stood out where he seemed to actually hit close to the truth of what really fuels terrorism.
When governments oppress their people, deny human rights, stifle dissent, or marginalize ethnic and religious groups or favor certain religious groups over others. It sows the seeds of extremism and violence. It makes those communities more vulnerable to recruitment. Terrorist groups claim that change can only come through violence. And if peaceful change is impossible, that plays into extremist propaganda.
Hussam, what do you make of what President Obama just said? And isn't the U.S. itself and its dictatorial allies, some of whose representatives were present, the source of the problem that he seemed to refer to, but maybe not get his own illusion?
I mean, if he's available, I would hire him. I couldn't have said it better. No one could have said it better. The only problem is he's missing the last piece of the puzzle. I mean, he's speaking about all of these real grievances and the cause of these grievances very correctly, except that he's describing it as if it has come from Mars. Some alien has dropped it on Earth. We are guilty of much of that. We are the ones fueling that occupation, that frustration. We are fueling, supporting, funding, arming that repression in much of the Middle East that is causing people to be pushed into the extreme, and then some of them unfortunately end up choosing violence as a means to responding to those injustices. So what he needed to say is to say, as he expects the American Muslim community and all communities to stand united and firmly against all form of violence and terrorism that is unjustified, of course, he needs to commit as a president of the largest superpower in the world today that we no longer will tolerate a government that engage in human rights violations, that we will no longer support and fund occupation, illegal occupation, and apartheid regimes, and governments that discriminate on the basis of religion or a sect or ethnic background. We cannot have the double talk. We cannot expect, and he cannot be preaching and patronizing American Muslims, a community that has done great work actually in reducing any impact of ISIS in this country. If anything, I would have loved for the president to announce a summit in which he invites American Muslims to commend them on their success in keeping ISIS out of this country. But instead of doing that, he actually invites American Muslims to patronize them, to tell them how to behave, how to teach their religion, and clear himself, vindicate his administration and former administrations and various Western countries from their responsibility for those injustices.
Now, Hussam, of course, he is also towing a tricky line because his speech and many of the speeches were more careful than right-wing commentators would have liked them to be. So on the one hand, of course, he's facing legitimate criticism from your organization and commentators like yourself. On the other hand, he's facing this very hysterical-sounding backlash from those who would have liked him to essentially demonize the entire community.
And no doubt, and that's what I said. What he is saying is something we appreciate, and we commend him for not falling into the pressure or under the pressure of the right-wing elements in our society and our world today who wish to blame Muslims and Islam for the fringe elements that commit these crimes. So we commend him for that. What we would have expected more from him is more honesty and more integrity in admitting guilt or responsibility for these problems. This is not an accusation. This is not an opinion. This is a fact. We do send billions of dollars to the occupation state of Israel. We do send billions of dollars and hundreds of millions of dollars at least to the government in Egypt. We do provide diplomatic support for governments such as UAE and others, which are clearly engaged, even according to the State Department reports on human rights, engaged in major, serious human rights violations. So this is not an accusation. This is not to put the president on the spot. This is about really upholding our values as Americans, which stands for liberty and justice for all.
Hussam, what has the backlash from the Muslim community been to this summit? I understand there was a Twitter campaign that entitled #Counter the Narrative. And then there were, of course, people who did go to the conference, as you said earlier, who expressed their criticism within the conference. Congressman Keith Ellison, the only Muslim representative of Congress who actually did address. So give us a flavor of the criticism of this conference and the response from the Muslim community.
I mean, I can say overwhelmingly, almost every single civil rights organization, not just within the Muslim community, within the general public, have spoken against or in opposition of the CVE program, the Countering Violent Extremism. Now, within the Muslim community, I can tell you almost all Muslim organizations, with the exception of a handful, maybe 2 or 3, have spoken. Dozens of them have spoken against CVE and have refused to basically endorse the government-initiated CVE program. The largest umbrella of national Muslim organization, called the U.S. Council of Muslim Organizations, have issued a strong statement rejecting that initiative. Locally here in Southern California, or actually in California, the largest umbrella of Muslim student association and organizations, called the MSA West, have issued a statement, a strong statement, also rejecting or refusing to endorse it just 2 days ago. The largest umbrella organization of all Southern California mosques and organizations on Saturday met and approved a resolution rejecting and refusing again to endorse this CVE program, and making it clear that they endorse the resolution or the statement issued by the U.S. Council of Muslim Organizations. I can tell you, right, on an activist level, also the same thing. People have rejected it, and they feel targeted by such programs.
So, Hussam, how, as far as you understand, what exactly is this program set up to do, aside from organizing a 3-day summit to have nice-sounding speeches? How exactly, what is the plan by the Justice Department on countering violent extremism? Do they, I mean, of course, we know since the years following 9/11, there's been a systematic infiltration of mosques and Muslim community groups, which have resulted in very little actual terrorism being rooted out. But do they have a plan?
And that is actually one of our biggest concerns, is that there haven't been transparent about the full details of the plan. All we know is that it's built on a failed model that existed in Europe, specifically in the UK, that is based on a youth radicalization analysis model, which uses certain indicators to identify people on the path of radicalization. You know, it could be how long your beard, have you started praying, do you wear a Muslim garb, quote unquote, how many times do you attend this mosque? What kind of political views do you have? And it's based on a partnership between the Muslim community and law enforcement. And unfortunately, I have to say, our trust in the integrity and the good work of federal law enforcement agencies has been shaken by many years of abuse from these same agencies, such as the FBI, which has engaged in entrapment of young Muslims, which has engaged in surveillance and spying at mosques and over people who go to the mosque. So, until we have a full understanding what the program entails, and until we can rebuild that trust, it is impossible to trust having these law enforcement agencies into our mosques and our communities, targeting us and impacting free speech, because I can tell you, many mosques are already afraid to talk about politics, talk about important issues, for fear that they will be branded as violent extremists, or ground for violent extremism.
Now, Hussam, the issues that you were raising earlier about the U.S.'s own culpability, we cover these on our program constantly, but when you encounter folks who don't have the background information, and all they see is the story of these 3 young girls, British Muslim girls, going to Istanbul to join ISIS, they're 15 and 16 years old, and it's really hard for people to understand what would drive, middle-class girls who come from decent families, have access to education, who seem to be very, at least geographically, far away from where the wars are being fought. What is attracting them to go and join this very, very fundamentalist extremist organization? How do you explain it?
It is not a linear action-reaction thing. It's not a one thing. There's no one factor, of course. I just came back from a trip to France, and I can tell you the situation of minorities in general and Muslims in specific in Europe is much worse than it is here in the U.S.
So they feel disaffected.
Exactly. There's an element of marginalization, feeling disenfranchised from the larger community, the sense of injustice. Also, there's a lack of understanding of Islam sometimes that plays a major role. A lot of these young people have not been that active in the Muslim community, not very well educated about Islam, so sometimes easily or more easier swayed by some of these videos and messages coming from ISIS and other terrorist groups. The reality is there are many factors. And we can say we're trying to prevent these factors from creeping into our own land here, by making sure that Muslims are not stigmatized, are not falsely accused, are not targeted. Our youth should not grow up living to prove their innocence. Our youth should not worry about our government and our law enforcement pointing fingers at them and accusing them to be suspects until they can prove otherwise. They should be welcomed and embraced as positive contributors to our country and on many levels and every level.
And so you're saying that in Europe the situation is much worse in terms of how Muslim communities feel marginalized, and yet it is the London model, the British model that the US government is attempting to emulate in rooting out homegrown terrorism, when that is not even really a problem here in the US, at least not yet.
Exactly, and that model actually has been stopped in the UK. They've moved to another model because they've realized it failed.
Yeah.
It doesn't work.
Well,
we took their failed model.
I want to thank you so much, Hussam, for shedding light on this issue, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sonali, for having me.
Hussam Ayloush is my guest. He's a human rights and civil rights activist and a community organizer and executive director of the Los Angeles area office of the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR. He's also the third-term elected executive board member to the California Democratic Party and serves on the board of the Muslim American Homeland Security Congress. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. The Equal Justice Initiative recently released a groundbreaking report on lynchings of African Americans in the United States and found that nearly 4,000 documented lynchings occurred between the years 1877 to 1950. While the gruesome incidents of murder are well established in our history books, the total number of African Americans lynched is about 700 higher than previously thought. But that's not all. Another grisly chapter in American history is the lynching of Mexicans. In numbers second only to African Americans, thousands of Mexicans were reportedly lynched in the late 1800s to early 1900s. With little remaining documentation, the lynchings of 547 Mexicans have been verified, but the true number stands likely much higher. My guest is William Carrigan. He's a chair and professor of history at Rowan University, author of The Making of Lynching Culture, Violence and Vigilantism in Central Texas, 1836 to 1916. Together with his collaborator Clive Webb, he's published numerous essays on the same topic, including Forgotten Dead, Mob Violence Against Mexicans in the United States, 1848 to 1928. Their op-ed in the Friday edition of the New York Times was entitled When Americans Lynched Mexicans. Welcome to Uprising.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, who exactly was being lynched? Are we talking about Mexicans who were part of a migrant workforce, or Latinos who were always here, those who had long come and gone over the border for generations? Were there Central Americans who were also lynched, or were they just seen as part of the same group of people by white Americans?
That's a good question. We decided to just talk about Mexicans who were lynched because early on we discovered that they were by far the greatest Spanish-speaking group that was in fact lynched in our records, but that does not mean that there were not other Spanish speakers, in particular Chileans and Peruvians were also lynched, especially in the gold rush period. In terms of their nationality, early on, in the middle of the 19th century, all of the individuals would have been Mexican citizens at one point in time, of course, but then many of course, became U.S. citizens after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It is probably true, although the evidence is very hard to get at, but it's probably true that most of the victims of lynching were poor, many of them laborers, which does not mean that the whites who are intent on enacting mob violence were not interested in acquiring the property of wealthier landowners, but their primary means to do so was to attack the weaker and more vulnerable laborers for these wealthier landlords.
Now, we understand the lynchings of African Americans as a legacy of the institution of slavery. There's a direct reason linked to the reasons for that horror. But what were the lynchings of Mexicans ideologically based on, if there was any basis?
Well, I guess the answer there is it's several different things. First of all, if you asked the lynchers themselves, they would have cited, and they often did, the idea that the legal system in the West was not fully functional, that the jails weren't to be trusted, and that this was frontier justice, and it was meted out not only to Mexicans, but to Anglos and to others as well. And we talk about this explanation at length in our book, and our answer is yes, this is a factor, especially in, say, the early parts of the gold rush. It would not be wise to just dismiss this justification out of hand. There were times and places where the legal system really was not functioning well, and individuals felt that the criminal threat was so great, they took the law into their own hands. Now, we don't believe that this justifies lynching even in this case, but it should be pointed out that this was true. But very quickly, we find that this explanation continues, but the circumstances no longer warranted. In other words, while there is some justification and truth to this justification early on, it quickly becomes a justification that is stated, but there's really other unstated motivations behind the mob violence that's taking place. And some of this is true even at the very beginning of mob violence against Mexicans. And just briefly, we emphasize economic factors. During the California Gold Rush, it's obviously the battle over mining claims. In South Texas, it's the battle for control of land. And then throughout the American Southwest, there's a battle over the terms and conditions of labor that underlies a lot of anti-Mexican mob violence.
Now, were the lynchings carried out in geographically the same areas that the lynchings of African Americans were carried out, or was it more of a Southwest issue?
Yeah, it's not going to overlap very much with the geographic spread of African Americans who are overwhelmingly lynched in the former states of the Confederacy in the South. It is true that Texas has a great number of lynchings of African Americans and of Mexicans, but even within Texas, there's going to be some geographic differences there, where most Mexicans were going to be lynched in South Texas and most African Americans in East Texas.
Right. Now you mentioned mining rights and economic factors as motivating these murders, but what about sort of collective punishment against Mexicans for speaking their language, for expressing their culture? Because there are signs from the period, no Spanish speakers or Mexicans allowed, whites only. Was this also a cultural imperialist issue, if you will?
Well, I think that we do emphasize racism and prejudice as a very critical factor. Essentially, our argument works like this. Even if there are economic reasons for attacking a certain group, it's not something that necessarily inevitably happens. There were French and English and Irish gold seekers as well, and they were not attacked in the same level and degree as were Mexicans. Mexicans were disproportionately targeted by mobs, and we argue that the reason is because of the deep-rooted anti-Mexican sentiments held by many whites. It was easier to talk oneself into lynching a Mexican than it was into, say, lynching a French gold miner.
Now, the lynchings of black men were these horrific spectacles, as the Equal Justice Initiative and others have pointed out, with hundreds or thousands of people gathering with a picnic-like atmosphere in some cases, whole families, children present. Were there similar circumstances for lynchings of Mexicans as well?
There certainly were. So, I mean, the short answer is yes. There were episodes of lynchings of Mexicans in which, you know, crowds in the thousands viewed the execution, in which there was dismemberment and mutilation of the corpse. But I think it should be pointed out that compared to African Americans, the number of these cases is far smaller. The reasons for that are probably multiple, but I think the most important one is that there are chronological differences between the lynchings of the two groups. Most lynchings of Mexicans took place in the 19th century, with a very violent outburst in the second decade of the 20th century. But many of the spectacle lynchings of African Americans are very late 19th and then early 20th century. And relatively speaking, most of the violence against Mexicans had occurred earlier than that. And that leads to different densities of population. It's also true that, of course, the West, even in the early 20th century, had a different density of population than did the South. And, of course, if you're looking to try to amass 10,000 spectators, it's much easier to do that in some places than others.
Now, in your op-ed, you cited how in November 1873, 7 Mexican shepherds were hanged by white vigilantes near Corpus Christi, Texas. And just as an example of, you know, these sorts of horrific incidents, can you tell our listeners and our viewers this story so that we can get a better picture of how this history unfolded?
Absolutely. So this case was one that the local media relatively ignored. We discovered this case through the investigation of the Mexican government. What happened was that there was a wealthy landowner named Toribio Lozano. He owned property in both Mexico and in Texas, of course, before the U.S.-Mexican War. The property probably conjoined. And he was living in Mexico when he received a telegram that every one of his employees on a ranch in Texas that he owned had been killed. They were, in fact, found hanged, all from trees near one another on his property. They had been shepherds that he had been employing to tend his flock. And he immediately came to Texas and investigated, and he concluded that the intent of the violence was to intimidate him into selling his property. And we believe that this case is, in fact, a good example of one of the consequences of anti-Mexican mob violence in South Texas, which was to intimidate Mexicans into abandoning South Texas, returning to Mexico. There were a number of whites, of course, in South Texas that opposed this violence, and it's always it's hard to tell a complicated story sometimes. But there were whites in South Texas who wanted to ally with Mexicans and wanted them there, both as fellow landowners. They intermarried sometimes into their families. But then there were some whites who believed that Texas should be only for whites and wanted to chase all Mexicans out.
Right. Well, and of course we see echoes of that today, even if the lynchings aren't happening. And I want to ask you about that in just a few minutes. But why did these lynchings eventually stop? You brought up the Mexican government. Did the Mexican government play a role?
Yeah, there are probably many factors, but the one that my co-author and I emphasize in our book is the role of the Mexican government. It's one of the things that's a difference between the African-American case and the Mexican case. African-Americans did not have the resources that Mexicans did to protest. One, Mexicans could, in fact, flee to Mexico across the border and provide some safety there. And then second, they could appeal to the Mexican government for intervention if they were Mexican nationals. The Mexican government, and of course, the stability of the Mexican government waned and waxed over time. But overall, we believe that the the persistent diplomatic protest by Mexican officials eventually had a cumulative impact on things in the Southwest. Particularly by the 1890s, these diplomats finally succeeded in getting the U.S. federal government to pay indemnities to the families of lynching victims. And then from that point forward, the federal government, much more so than in the case of blacks, cared about the lynching of Mexicans. And it was something that eventually the federal government, by the 1920s, actually intervened and actually ended up prosecuting and sending to jail a Anglo sheriff who had lynched Mexicans under his control.
Well, finally, why is this history so little known, and how important is it to have this historical context when we see sort of ongoing, very negative discourse against Mexicans and Central Americans and other Spanish-speaking communities today?
Yeah, I absolutely. I think it's important for kind of our ongoing civic debate. I think there's two things: Mexicans and Anglo-Americans, white Americans don't remember the past in the same way, and this makes conversation and dialogue about current politics very tricky. So whites are largely unaware of this violence against Mexicans and don't understand when Mexicans kind of put modern-day anti-Mexican nativism and violence into this historical context. And, likewise, sometimes, people will say that they believe that the violence that is taking place along the border is similar to lynching, and of course we believe that there are some differences between what happened in the past and what happens in the present.
Finally, where can listeners and viewers get a hold of your work? You have a book out. Is there a website you can recommend if they want to learn more about this history and maybe shocked to hear about it?
Well, yes, certainly our book that was published by Oxford is the key source I would recommend individuals to. We also have a Facebook page, Facebook/Forgotten Dead. Oxford University Press also has our book and information about it on their website.
That's facebook.com/Forgotten Dead. And of course, there's also the New York Times op-ed on Friday that you and your collaborator put out. And I should mention your collaborator is British and is also studying this from another part of the world. And that must be an interesting experience for him to see this part of U.S. history.
Absolutely. He brings us a different perspective than maybe perhaps an American might, and I think it's enriched our study, kind of a perception of an outsider.
Well, William Carrigan, I want to wish you the best of luck, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for your time.
William Carrigan is my guest. He is the chair and professor of history at Rowan University, and together with his collaborator Clive Webb, he's published numerous essays on the topic of lynchings of Mexicans. And his book includes the making of a lynching. His books include the making of a lynching culture, violence, and vigilantism in Central Texas, 1836 to 1916, and also Forgotten Dead: Mob Violence Against Mexicans in the United States, 1848 to 1928. The op-ed in the Friday edition of the New York Times was entitled "When Americans Lynched Mexicans." This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Jennifer McMartin is our research intern. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Christian Beck is our production assistant. Federico Garcia, Kiana Turner, and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Camilo Ramirez is our sound editor. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising.